We have never been so busy here at the Dreamland Motel. This weekend marks our very first UFO conference. And we're almost sold out. Almost. There's still room for a few more. One of my more ambitious ideas to raise the profile of our otherwise quiet little establishment out here in the middle of nowhere. But for once, the car park is full, the bar is lively, the pool is bohemian, and the conference room is beginning to fill, slowly, as people take their seats in anticipation of tonight's speakers. It's a good turnout though not everyone here agrees. Each of our guests arrives with their own conclusions, their own interpretations, and their own followings. And when you place those ideas side by side, something begins to feel slightly out of tune. Tonight we're not here to settle that, only to listen carefully and see where the lines cross and divide. 5 individuals, 5 very different explanations for the presence of non-human intelligence here on Earth. Why are they here? What do they want with humanity? Ask it 5 times and you'll get 5 different answers. Dr. Stephen Greer, David Icke, Chris Bledsoe, David Jacobs, and Dan Burrish. From quarantine to reptilian overseers, from spiritual guidance to hybrid integration, and even the possibility of future humans reaching back through time. Tonight we'll explore the ideas they've become known for. So welcome back. You've arrived just in time. If you enjoy your stay this evening, consider liking, subscribing, and let me know where you're arriving from and what time it is for you. And to our residential guests here on YouTube and our Patreon members, thank you. Without your support, the guests would likely be sharing hot water tonight. If you'd like to support the motel, you'll find the details below. But no pressure. Now, our first speaker will be arriving shortly, so let's get you settled. Grab a seat in the conference room through the double doors. Help yourself to a complimentary tea or coffee, and let's begin. Our first speaker this evening is Dr. Stephen Greer. He is often introduced as a former emergency room physician, but his story begins much earlier. Greer was born in 1955 in North Carolina, growing up in modest conditions, while also having early proximity to advanced aerospace ideas through a family connection to the Apollo program. That contrast between everyday life and the frontier of technological possibility remained present as he grew up, forming a quiet backdrop to the experiences that followed. At the age of 8, he witnessed a structured, silent craft moving through the sky in broad daylight, an event that stayed with him as something unresolved, something that didn't sit comfortably within the explanations available to him at the time. It marked an early awareness that there were aspects of reality that extended beyond what was commonly understood. As he moved into adolescence, his focus began to shift toward medicine, influenced in part by a serious physical injury and resulting illness that occurred in the months leading up to what would later become his most defining experience. In the spring of 1973, during a long bike ride, Greer sustained what he later described as a relatively mundane injury, a tear in his thigh. Under different circumstances, it may have required only routine medical attention, though his family's financial situation made that difficult, and without proper treatment, the wound became infected, and over time that infection spread, eventually affecting his kidneys and liver What began as a leg injury developed into a systemic crisis, and according to Greer's account, his condition worsened to the point where his body began to fail. And it's during this period that Greer entered the near-death state. He recalled a moment in which his awareness seemed to separate from the physical body, entering into what he would later call a state of unbounded consciousness, where perception extended beyond ordinary sensory limits and into something more expansive and continuous. This experience was not described as abstract or symbolic, but as immediate and real, a state in which identity itself appeared to loosen at the edges, replaced by a broader sense of awareness that was not confined to a single point or moment. And then, quite suddenly, the fever broke. By his account, his condition improved rapidly, and he recovered in a way that appeared disproportionate to the severity of the illness he had just experienced. This event took place only a few months before another encounter he would later describe, on a mountain in North Carolina. And while the two experiences are distinct, they appear closely linked in the way that he understands them. Many people who have lived through near-death experiences, or even brief periods of clinical death, describe a profound shift in how they perceive reality afterwards. The world can feel altered in subtle but lasting ways, as though something previously unseen has come into view. There is often a sense that existence extends beyond what is immediately visible, that ordinary perception only captures a fraction of what may be there. For some, this leads to a deep curiosity about consciousness itself, a desire to explore stillness, to quieten the mind, not necessarily through organized religion, but through practices that allow awareness to expand beyond its usual boundaries. The state reached during a near-death experience is often described as calm, expansive, and uninterrupted by the constant movement of thought. And in its aftermath, there can be a pull to return to that same clarity, though by safer, more deliberate means. In Greer's case, this period appears to have marked a turning point. The experience introduced him to that form of awareness that extends beyond the physical body, and the encounter that followed gave that awareness direction. A few months later, Greer travelled to a mountain in North Carolina, where he sat alone at dusk in a state of quiet meditation. The setting was simple: open sky, fading light, that familiar stillness that settles just before night finally arrives. While sitting there, he observed what he described as a silver disk hovering silently in the sky above him. What followed moved beyond observation. He reported that a luminous being appeared nearby, with large dark eyes and a calm presence, approaching him and placing a hand on his shoulder. In that moment, his sense of physical surroundings shifted immediately. The mountain, the ground beneath him, the immediate environment receded, replaced by the sensation of floating in open space surrounded by the stars. He described this state again as unbounded consciousness, though now accompanied by a sense of interaction rather than isolation. It's within this state, he alleges, communication occurred. Though there were no spoken words, no audible exchange, but rather a form of understanding taking place through directed thought. An interaction with what he called a mind without borders, an intelligence that didn't appear to operate within the same constraints as human cognition. It might not seem completely obvious, but in my opinion, it's in the way Greer talks about these early experiences that we receive our first glimpse of what I now understand as highly foundational to Greer's entire belief system. This experience didn't remain as memory alone, but as a framework through which he interpreted everything else that followed. Greer would later state that this encounter formed the basis for what became known as the CE5 protocols, the idea that contact with non-human intelligence can be initiated by humans through consciousness itself. In his telling, these protocols emerged from that initial interaction, shaped by the understanding that communication occurs entirely through awareness and intention and coherence of thought rather than through physical signaling. Years later, this led to the establishment of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, or CSETI, in 1990, where these ideas were formalized and shared more widely. And alongside this, Greer pursued his medical career, working in emergency medicine and eventually serving as chairman within his department. During this time, he maintained a parallel line of inquiry, continuing to explore the implications of consciousness and contact, while operating within a highly structured professional environment. But as the early 1990s progressed, this personal framework began to intersect with institutional inquiry. Greer started identifying and interviewing individuals within military and intelligence environments who had encountered anomalous craft or technologies. These were individuals whose roles required structured observation and reporting, and their accounts formed the basis of what would become the Disclosure Project, an effort to bring forward testimony that in Greer's view demonstrated a consistent and ongoing presence on planet Earth. It is from this combination that his conclusions begin to emerge. On one side, there is direct personal experience, particularly the idea that consciousness can act as a medium for communication, and on the other, the growing archive of testimony suggesting that unidentified craft are interacting with human systems in ways that appear structured rather than random. And together, these lead him toward a specific interpretation of motive. Greer presents non-human intelligence as largely non-hostile, describing a presence that appears attentive and measured. His reason often returns to the question of capability, suggesting that a civilization capable of reaching Earth would possess technological advantages far beyond those currently available to humanity, and that this level of advancement would allow for decisive action if it were intended. Human civilization continues to develop. It's that continuity that carries significance. Instead of overt conflict, he describes a pattern of monitoring, particularly around nuclear weapons and energy systems. Testimony gathered through the Disclosure Project includes repeated accounts of unidentified craft appearing near nuclear facilities, with some reports describing interference with missile systems or temporary disruptions of equipment. To Greer, this suggests that non-human intelligence is observing points at which human activity carries large-scale risk and consequence, particularly as it relates to technologies capable of widespread harm. And further to this, Greer asserts that these intelligences may hold a degree of concern regarding the trajectory humanity appears to be on. The idea that governments may be in possession of technology recovered from non-human craft, whether through accidental crashes, deliberate retrieval, or something more cooperative, is not unique to Greer. In fact, you could argue it's a cornerstone of ufology, appearing again and again across decades of testimony and speculation. Where Greer's perspective becomes more defined is in what follows from that premise. He claims that technologies derived from these encounters, particularly in the fields of propulsion and energy, have been understood for many decades. Anti-gravity systems, he suggests, were developed as far back as the mid-20th century, alongside energy sources, capable of fundamentally reshaping human civilization. According to his view, these developments have not been shared in the way they should have been, and instead have been held within deeply compartmentalized structures that operate beyond conventional oversight. Within this interpretation, the risk is not the presence of non-human intelligence itself. The risk emerges from how these technologies have been controlled. Greer describes a network of private and quasi-governmental interests operating outside elected authority, maintaining secrecy through a combination of classification, disinformation, and in some cases, coercion. He has gone further, suggesting that this structure may have been responsible for serious crimes, including the suppression of individuals and information that might otherwise challenge its position. Extending this idea, he has also proposed that many accounts traditionally understood as alien abductions are instead human-led operations, conducted using advanced aerospace technologies designed to simulate non-human encounters. This concept, often referred to as MyLab, introduces the possibility that some of the most unsettling aspects of the phenomenon may originate much closer to home. But Greer doesn't stop there. He has warned of a potential future plan in which this same technological, quote, stagecraft could be used to simulate a large-scale extraterrestrial threat, creating a global sense of urgency and fear that could be used to justify increased control over the world's population. It is, by any measure, a far-reaching claim, though not an inconsistent one when placed alongside Greer's other ideas, and he's by no means the first ufologist to float the idea of a false flag alien invasion. At the same time, there remains the other side to his work. Alongside the institutional critique, there is a continued emphasis on contact, consciousness, and what he describes as the peaceful nature of non-human intelligence. Greer maintains that these intelligences have demonstrated incredible restraint over a prolonged period, and that their presence reflects observation, possibly a form of careful nurturing rather than direct intervention. He's been known to describe humanity's situation as a form of quarantine. This period of observation, perhaps while humanity moves through a stage of development that carries both potential and risk. Greer's most steadfast belief, his highest degree of certainty, is that the only danger facing humanity is humanity. The extent to which this certainty is grounded in his claimed direct interactions with non-human intelligence is not always clearly defined, and it leaves open a question that sits quietly beneath his conclusions. A question that perhaps would be best answered directly. So, without further ado, please welcome to the stage Dr. Stephen Greer. Oh.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
You're serious?
Absolutely.
I've just been told that he won't be joining us this evening. Apparently he's been called into Washington for an urgent briefing with the President. Details, I'm told, remain undisclosed. Well, no matter. We still have some excellent speakers joining us tonight. So let's move on. Before his name became associated with expansive theories about reality, control, and non-human influence, David Icke occupied a very different place in public life. He was a professional footballer, and later a well-known sports broadcaster for the BBC, a familiar and trusted face, grounded firmly within the structures of mainstream media. For a time, His life followed a trajectory that felt predictable, repeated many times throughout the decades. Then, 1990 came around, and something changed. Icke describes this period as a kind of awakening, though the word itself seems almost too simple for the way he explains it. Over the course of several months, he experienced what he later framed as a collapse and reconstruction of perception itself. He spoke about this transformation in technological terms, describing his mind as if it had frozen under the weight of new information, before suddenly clearing, revealing something that had always been there, but had gone unnoticed. In his own words, it was as though the filter had been removed. What followed was not a single conclusion, but more a reordering of how he interpreted everything around him. During this period, Icke began to describe himself in ways that brought immediate public attention, including identifying as an expression of what he called the Godhead, a term he later clarified as referring to a universal consciousness that all beings are part of. Now, to be clear, the idea of a universal consciousness may not sound completely wild in 2026, but in the early 1990s, for an ex-footballer and then sports broadcaster to be talking about these kind of things was considered career suicide. In some ways, it was the death of one David Icke and the birth of another. In 1991, he appeared on Wogan. Not Rogan, Wogan. One of, if not the most popular British TV talk show in the late 80s and early 90s. His ideas were met with open ridicule. The interview became a defining moment, not because of what was said, but because of how it was received. Laughter from the audience, a sense that something had gone wrong, that a familiar figure had stepped too far outside the boundaries of acceptable thought. For Icke, this began a period of what he would describe as a kind of crucible, a necessary phase that allowed him to continue his work without immediate suppression, precisely because he had been dismissed so completely. In the years that followed, he began building a framework that extended far beyond political conspiracy or institutional critique, and it became something broader, a theory about the nature of reality itself. At the centre of Icke's worldview is the idea that what we perceive as physical reality is only a narrow band of a much larger field. He describes the human experience as analogous to a biological computer, where the five senses act as receivers, decoding a limited range of frequencies into the world we experience as solid and real. And reality is not fixed, it's interpreted. And if perception can be influenced, then so can the world that emerges from it. This is where his ideas begin to intersect with non-human intelligence. But before we go there, let's talk about this worldview for a moment. In my opinion, it's easy to characterize the way Icke describes reality as almost ahead of its time. But there is something much older sitting beneath it, a familiar thread that appears again and again across human history and across human cultures. In Hindu philosophy, there is a concept of Maya. Maya describes the world as it appears to us, as a kind of illusion, not in the sense that nothing exists, but in the sense that what we perceive is not the full picture. In this view, reality is filtered, shaped by the mind, entangled with perception, in a way that obscures a deeper truth beneath it. The world is experienced as real, but it isn't necessarily reality in its entirety. And then, of course, there's Plato. In his allegory of the cave, he describes a group of people who have spent their entire lives facing a wall, watching shadows cast by objects behind them. For them, those shadows are the reality, because they've never seen anything else. And when one of them is freed, stepping outside the cave and seeing the world as it is, the experience is overwhelming. When they return to tell the others, they are not believed. The shadows, after all, are familiar and comfortable. To a Western world, at the time, these were ideas that could feel abstract, philosophical, slightly out of reach of everyday life. Certainly not the kind of thing you'd casually introduce to a late-night television audience. And in that sense, Ike was very much a fish out of water, a familiar face, speaking in unfamiliar terms. But is he a fish out of water now? Because in the mid-2020s, simulation theory has become extremely popular. It's discussed openly, not just in philosophy, but in science and technology. Figures like Elon Musk have entertained the possibility that reality may well be a constructed environment, while researchers like Donald Hoffman have built entire careers around the idea that our senses do not show us reality as it is, but as it is useful for survival, or perhaps more meaningful for something deeper. Of all of Ike's ideas, this is now an easier one to sit with. At the very least, an interesting place to hang your curiosity for the night. But of course, say the words David Icke to most people, and you'll usually get the same immediate response. Is that the guy that thinks the royal family are reptilians? Icke does not generally describe these intelligences as extraterrestrial in the conventional sense. Instead, he presents them as interdimensional entities, existing outside that narrow frequency band that human senses can detect. In his model, these entities interact with humanity by influencing perception itself, shaping the way reality is experienced, rather than entering it in an obvious physical form. And from here, he begins to describe what they want with humanity. Icke describes these entities as feeding on emotional energy, particularly states such as fear, anxiety, and conflict. He refers to this energy as something generated within the human experience and harvested through systems that encourage division, instability, and stress. Events such as war, social unrest, and continuous crisis take on an additional layer of meaning. They are not only human phenomena. They are part of a larger system, a kind of energetic economy. And to sustain this system, Icke proposes the existence of a control structure operating within human society itself. This includes institutions of power, political systems, financial networks, and media structures, all contributing, in his view, to the maintenance of a controlled perceptual environment. He extends this further through the idea of hybrid bloodlines. Certain families or groups, he suggests, acts as intermediaries, maintaining influence across generations and ensuring continuity of the system. These individuals are described as either directly connected to or influenced by the non-human intelligences he identifies. This is not presented as symbolic. It's literal within his framework. Alongside this, Icke introduces the concept of a perceptual prison, a limitation imposed on human awareness that restricts experience to what he calls five-sense reality, preventing individuals from recognizing the broader nature of existence. Humanity is not only controlled externally, but internally constrained, operating within a narrow band of perception that, as we've already said, hides the larger structure from view. Within this prison, control becomes self-sustaining. If perception defines reality, and perception is managed, then the system maintains itself through the very individuals it contains. The evidence Icke presents for this framework differs significantly from that of someone like Greer. Rather than relying on institutional testimony or documented encounters, Icke builds his case through synthesis. He draws connections across ancient mythology, religious texts, historical patterns, and modern cultural narratives, suggesting that recurring symbols and themes point toward a shared, underlying truth. But what is that underlying truth? According to Icke, what do they want with humanity? We've talked about the desires to feed on negative human emotions, but what's the end game? Looking forward, Icke extends his ideas into what he describes as a technological endpoint. He has spoken about the possibility of increasing integration between human cognition and artificial systems, suggesting that such a development could further narrow independent perception. And in this view, this is not simply a natural progression of technology, but part of a larger arc, one that aligns with the same underlying pattern of control he has described since the 90s. He has referenced such figures as Ray Kurzweil, pointing to predictions that by around 2030, artificial intelligence may be connected directly to the human brain, gradually taking over more aspects of thought and decision-making. This is not framed as augmentation, but rather replacement, a process through which independent human cognition becomes less necessary and eventually less present. In interviews, including more recent discussions, he describes this as the emergence of a kind of hive mind, where individuals remain physically separate but are connected through a shared informational network. Within that system, perception itself could be influenced externally, and emotional responses could be shaped in ways that feel internal but originate elsewhere. In other words, a kind of emotional factory farm. The mechanism he outlines is both technological and environmental. A network of satellites, electromagnetic fields, and advanced materials interacting with the human body, creating conditions in which consciousness can be guided, adjusted, or even overridden. These ideas sit alongside broader global initiatives, timelines, and technological roadmaps, which he interprets as converging toward a common point. And it's that point that, in his view, is approaching. Icke may well still have the attention of people's curiosity when it comes to the Matrix, and perhaps more importantly, how to escape it. But I'm sure he wouldn't mind admitting that venturing further than that, into the realms of interdimensional reptilian overseers of reality, is, at least for the time being, too big a pill to swallow for most. But we must remember the kind of world that is being revealed to us, more and more, as a society. We don't need to go too far into detail. There are already enough people talking about it. But there have been moments, recent ones, where fragments of extremely sensitive information have surfaced. Glimpses into the behavior of individuals in power that feel difficult to fully process, uncomfortable, even terrifying. And while it might still feel almost satirical to say the phrase, Icke was right, when we describe the truly evil nature that appears to now be on display for Western culture to see, it's plausible to imagine that somewhere behind that satire there may well be an air of truth, that perhaps there may be more still to come. We've already come this far. We've watched ideas move in just a few short years, from the absurd into something more assumed. Things that once felt impossible, now sitting at the very least within the realm of discussion. And when that boundary shifts, it rarely stops where we expect it to. So perhaps it's time we listened. Let him share his own ideas in his own words. So, please welcome David Icke.
He's not here.
What?
He's gone.
What do you mean he's gone? He was in the bar less than an hour ago.
He's gone.
Well, where did he go? How do you lose him? He doesn't just disappear into another dimension. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, it seems David has transcended. We'll try and find him. In the meantime, let's move on to our next speaker. There are, after all, more perspectives to consider, and they don't all describe the same world. In some respects, Chris Bledsoe's story is simpler to wrap your head around. You've likely heard it before in some capacity. We've talked about him several times. But as we stand here in early April 2026, we find ourselves approaching the edge of something that sits quietly at the centre of his account. A moment in time that has been described as a prophecy, or rather, the lady's prophecy, translated for us by Bledsoe. So why talk about him again? Well, because his perspective is relevant. In many ways, his story reflects how a large number of experiencers come to understand the phenomenon, something that, once witnessed directly, becomes difficult to interpret without arriving at a particular conclusion. That whatever is interacting with us is not hostile, and that something like love, however loosely defined, may in fact play a central role in how the human story unfolds. There's a certain familiarity to that idea, even a tendency to dismiss it. That phrase, "I bring you love," it almost invites a reaction, a quiet eye roll, the assumption that this belongs to the love and light crowd. But it's not a small crowd at all. Greer, in his own way, touches the same space, though where Bledsoe differs is in what he believes is actually happening, because in his view, this isn't a quarantine, it's guidance, an interaction that appears to be leading somewhere, toward a shift, a change in understanding, a new knowledge. Chris Bledsoe's story begins in its most widely shared form in 2007. At the time, he was living in North Carolina, dealing with the kind of pressures that don't often make it into the headlines. Business struggles, financial strain, a diagnosis of Crohn's disease that had begun to take its toll physically, steadily wearing down his sense of stability. By his own account, things had reached a point where something needed to change. So one afternoon he went out into the woods near the Cape Fear River with his son and a friend, not in search of anything unusual, but simply to step away for a while, to clear his head, to breathe. What followed is where his story begins to diverge into the profound. While walking near the river, Bledsoe reported seeing lights, unusual at first, though not immediately alarming. Small orbs moving in ways that didn't align with reality. At some point, he became separated from the others. And then, according to his account, the experience intensified. Time seemed to break. There were gaps, moments unaccounted for, a sense that something had occurred that he could not fully reconstruct in sequence. When he returned, he described having encountered beings, though not in the structured mechanical sense often described in abduction narratives, but something more fluid, more esoteric, more difficult to categorize. Alongside this, there was a reported sense of communication, again not through spoken language, but more intuitive, emotional and direct. And then there was the aftermath. Bledsoe has stated that following this experience, his symptoms of Crohn's disease began to subside. Over time, he described a level of recovery that he associated directly with the encounter, interpreting it as a form of healing. For him, this was not simply an anomalous event. It was a turning point. From that moment onward, the phenomenon didn't recede, it continued. Bledsoe began reporting repeated sightings of luminous orbs, often described as moving with intention, responding to presence, at times appearing in ways that suggested interaction, more than just observation. These experiences were not always solitary. Others, including family members and visitors, reported witnessing similar phenomena. And allegedly, these encounters continue to this day, frequently. And this is where the figure he refers to as the lady enters the narrative. Bledsoe describes the lady as a presence that carries a distinctly feminine quality, though not bound to any single religious framework. In different moments, he has associated her with figures that appear across multiple traditions, Marian imagery, ancient goddesses, symbolic representations of what might be described as a divine feminine. The communication attributed to this presence carries a consistent tone. No force, no necessary directive, just guiding. Bledsoe has described receiving messages that relate to humanity's future, warnings in some cases, though not inevitable outcomes, more possibilities, paths that can be altered. He has spoken about humanity being at a crossroads, about imbalance, about a need to reconnect with something that has long been overlooked. And within that, there is often a recurring theme. Humanity has, in some way, lost its direction. So, according to Bledsoe, what are the motives of the non-human intelligence he's allegedly in contact with? Since Bledsoe's encounter, he has received an unexpected level of attention from individuals and agencies that, according to mainstream culture, have no obvious reason to be investigating his claims. We've spoken about Tim Taylor before, his involvement with NASA, and his interest in the Bledsoe family, and I don't feel the need to revisit the specifics of that relationship here. But for a moment, put yourself in Bledsoe's shoes. He's not the only person to have reported seeing orbs, or encountering beings, or feeling in contact with something beyond ordinary understanding. These kinds of experiences are not as rare as they are often assumed to be. And yet, not everyone receives this level of attention. Not everyone finds themselves in conversation with individuals connected to institutions that operate at the very edge of what is publicly acknowledged. That alone becomes part of the experience, another layer, something that, from his perspective, lends weight to what he first encountered. And in that sense, it becomes easier to understand why he continues to follow where these experiences lead him. Whether this attention represents a carefully managed narrative, a psyop if you will, or a genuine interest in something that cannot be openly discussed, is not something we can resolve here. But for Bledsoe, the meaning behind it is more immediate. His belief rests on his connection with whatever it is he feels he is in communication with. and the attention that followed serves at least to him as further confirmation that he is moving in the right direction. But unlike Greer's structured interpretation or Icke's expansive system of control, Bledsoe's perspective is entirely experiential. Less system, more relationship. He presents the phenomenon as something that exists across categories, part physical, part spiritual, part symbolic. A sort of living metaphor. The entities involved are not easily defined as extraterrestrial in the traditional sense. They appear in his telling to operate across layers of reality, similar to Icke's interpretation, intersecting with human perception in ways that feel both external and deeply internal. But here Bledsoe diverges from Icke. The non-human intelligence's motive, as he understands it, centers on guidance, a form of intervention that doesn't impose itself, but instead offers direction, a subtle influence, encouraging movement toward a different state of being. And then there's the sense of warning. Bledsoe has spoken about the possibility of large-scale disruption, often framed through symbolic language that echoes almost a religious narrative. References to cycles, renewal, to events that could reshape human society. But among these warnings, there is prophecy, the hill that Chris Bledsoe appears willing to stand on as we turn the corner into the exact time frame that he has suggested will transform the world in one way or another. A new knowledge, as told to him by the lady. Something that, by his account, should begin to come into view between now and the end of October 2026. And what that new knowledge means could be many things. In some respects, that could be a saving grace, cushioned by the relative safety of ambiguity. But perhaps it's worth setting a threshold. After all, not a day has gone by in 2026 where the world hasn't learned something new. That alone isn't enough. What I find myself looking for is something more fundamental, a profound shift, a moment where humanity begins to see itself differently, its place in the universe, its history, its trajectory, all brought into sharper focus. Call it disclosure, call it a rediscovery of something long forgotten. I just want a quiet kind of ontological shock. Something that changes the way we understand what it means to be human. And I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation. Regardless, Bledsoe's description of these continued interactions and what he would likely characterize as a relationship with orbs in the sky is underwritten by an overwhelming experiential sense that love is the driving factor behind all of it. He goes as far as calling them angels, though again trying to avoid a religious designation for the most part. But with Bledsoe, the love and light narrative is alive and well, for now. We have angels, or loving beings watching over us, guiding us into the new age that they themselves have promised to deliver, and deliver soon. So before that happens, it's probably best we get him up here to share his experiences with us. Here he is. Chris? Chris? You've got to be kidding. Is that him? Is he driving off down the desert road? What's he chasing? It looks like another orb. Couldn't it have waited just a few minutes? Well, we don't have time to wait for him to come back, if he does come back at all. Let's just move on and hope he returns. Our next speaker this evening is Dr. David Jacobs. In many ways, his perspective sits at the far edge of the spectrum that we've explored so far tonight, one that feels less concerned with meaning or interpretation, and more focused on process, something structured, repeated, and in his view already in motion. Where Bledsoe describes guidance, and where others speak in terms of connection or influence, Jacobs describes something far more methodical, something that unfolds with a kind of internal logic that doesn't rely on belief so much as pattern. David Jacobs is an historian by training, a former associate professor at Temple University, and someone whose professional life has been shaped by the careful study of events, documents, and the way patterns emerge over time when enough information is placed side by side. His early interest in the UFO phenomenon followed a relatively traditional path, centered around sightings and reports. But over time, his attention began to shift toward a different category of experience. Not what people had seen, but what they believed had happened to them. Over a number of years, Jacobs conducted interviews with individuals who reported abduction experiences, accounts that at first appeared fragmented and difficult to organize into any sort of coherent structure. These were personal stories, often emotional, sometimes incomplete, and not easily reconciled with one another, at least at a surface level. But as the number of cases increased, things began to change. Those patterns started to emerge, not identical in every detail, though consistent enough in their structure that they began to suggest a kind of repetition. Individuals who had never met, separated by geography, background, and circumstance, were describing experiences that followed very similar sequences, involving comparable environments, procedures, and forms of interaction. Many of these accounts were explored through hypnotic regression, a method used in an attempt to access memories that were believed to be present, though not immediately available to conscious recall. Under these conditions, individuals would often describe their experiences in considerable detail, recalling events with a sense of clarity and emotional weight that to them felt entirely real. Over time, Jacobs began to treat these accounts less as isolated narratives and more as a growing body of data, something that could be examined, compared, and organized, and ultimately correlated. And within that growing body of material, he believed he was observing structure, something that behaved less like a collection of unrelated events, and more like a process unfolding across multiple individuals. And it's from here that Jacobs' conclusions began to take shape. Jacobs proposes that these experiences are part of a long-term coordinated program, one that centers on reproduction and the gradual creation of hybrid beings, entities that combine human and non-human characteristics, developed through repeated interaction over extended periods of time. In his interpretation, this isn't random, and it's not sporadic. It follows stages. Individuals describe being taken, examined, and involved in procedures that appear biological in nature, often relating to reproduction. Over time, these experiences evolve, with some individuals reporting interactions with hybrid beings themselves, beings that are presented to them, introduced, and in some cases entrusted to them in ways that suggest a form of familiarization. There is a sense within many of these accounts that something is being prepared, not in a distant or abstract sense, but in a way that feels altogether more incremental, as though each interaction forms part of a longer chain that is yet to fully resolve. So what within this framework are the motives of the non-human intelligence involved? Well, according to Jacobs, this is not a passive presence or a neutral interaction, but something far more deliberate, a program that appears to unfold gradually and with a clear sense of direction, largely outside of human awareness or consultation. He describes it as a form of planetary acquisition, not in the sense of a sudden invasion, but as a long-term process through which control is established, piece by piece, in ways that avoid confrontation and reduce the likelihood of resistance. And at the center of this process sits the aforementioned hybridization program. He describes these final stage beings as hybrids, entities that outwardly appear indistinguishable from humans, yet are said to possess an enhanced neurological capacity that allows them to influence human thought and behavior in subtle but meaningful ways. The process doesn't end with their creation, but continues into what he sees as a phase of integration. This is where abduction accounts begin to take on a particularly unusual character, as individuals report being asked to assist these beings in learning how to function within everyday human environments. They describe showing them how to carry out simple tasks, how to navigate social situations, how to engage in conversations in ways that would not draw attention, as though preparing them for a presence that extends beyond the confines of the encounters themselves. And running alongside these descriptions is a recurring reference to what is often simply called the change, a term that appears across multiple accounts without always being clearly defined, yet carries with it a shared sense of inevitability. Jacobs interprets this as the point at which the process reaches completion, where integration gives way to a more visible shift in structure, and where control begins to manifest in ways that are no longer easily concealed. In this eventuality, humanity is not removed, though its position changes. The role becomes diminished, repositioned within a system where authority has already begun to transition elsewhere. But not through force, through proximity, influence, and that gradual replacement. Jacobs also suggests that the various entities described within these encounters may represent specialized roles within some broader system. Beings commonly referred to as Greys, along with others reported in different forms, are understood within his framework as components of a larger operational structure, carrying out specific functions under the direction of a higher organizing intelligence. In some versions of his work, this idea extends further still, introducing the possibility that this process is not unique to Earth, but part of a wider method, something that may have been carried out elsewhere, refined over time and repeated. This places humanity not at the center of the phenomenon, but within a pattern that exists far beyond it. And underlying all of this is a consistent emphasis on secrecy. The experiences described are rarely shared openly. They're difficult to verify, and often accompanied by a sense of limited agency, with individuals reporting an inability to resist or fully control their responses during these encounters. Some of the compulsions described often border on the truly traumatic, and without repeating them here, just know that given any form of autonomy, you would undoubtedly choose not to participate. But within Jacob's interpretation, this lack of resistance is not incidental. It's part of the function, allowing the process to continue without interruption until such a point that concealment is no longer required. And within the accounts that support this theory, there is a tone that appears again and again. There is fear, certainly, and confusion, and a sense of violation in many cases, though there is also something else, something quieter and more difficult to place. That sense of routine that develops over repeated experiences, where individuals describe these events as something that has happened to them not once, but many times, sometimes across years, across generations. And within those accounts, there are moments that linger. But while we're here in this space, it is important to acknowledge that some of the methods used to gather these accounts have been subject of ongoing discussion. Hypnotic regression, while capable of producing detailed and emotionally rich narratives, exists within a broader understanding of memory that recognizes its complexity. Human recall is not fixed or perfectly preserved, and it can be shaped over time by suggestion, expectation, and the natural process of reconstruction that occurs whenever memories are revisited. But I assure you that's not an attempt to dismiss the experiences being described. But it does introduce a degree of uncertainty, a space in which meaning can form without always being directly tied to an external event. And yet, within Jacob's work, the consistency of these accounts remains central and notable. Patterns, when repeated often enough, begin to suggest intention, at least in his view. When placed alongside the perspectives we've explored so far, Jacob's interpretation introduces something distinctly different in tone, a cold, logical, and clinical approach to propagation throughout the cosmos, the act of a species that may well respect the sanctity of consciousness, but at the same time doesn't seek to be necessarily bound by nature's course. A species very much advancing its own interests at the potential expense of others. Sounds familiar. Perhaps Jacobs himself would care to elaborate on this idea further. So please welcome. Should I even bother asking? He's not here, is he? What happened this time? Abducted? I'm sure Greer would have a few words to say about that. Well, I guess we better move on. We do have one final speaker, and I'm sure he's here. Trust me. Dan Burrish. The scratch I just can't itch. His story is ridiculous. Truly, completely out there. The kind of thing that under normal circumstances you would dismiss almost immediately. But take a moment and be honest with yourself. Do you find his story even slightly more plausible now than you might have 5 years ago? The world has shifted in quiet yet undeniable ways. The ground beneath what we consider knowable has become less stable, and somewhere within that shift, even the most unlikely narratives begin to stay a little longer than they otherwise would have. There is perhaps a growing crisis of epistemology, a sense that certainty itself has become harder to hold on to, and within that uncertainty, we find ourselves here, listening to a man like Burrish, and at least in my case, actually considering what he's saying, in spite of myself. There is something about the way he tells his story. The confidence, absolutely. Though more than that, it's the consistency. The way he moves through an extraordinarily complex narrative, rich with detail, without any hesitation, without visible strain, as though he is simply recalling something that, to him, is entirely real. But in truth, we are not here because we believe him. We are here because his story represents something else, a possibility, one that stretches far beyond the boundaries of conventional physics, and yet somehow still appeals to that same quiet sense of wonder that seems to sit at the centre of all of this. Because if Burrish is right, then alien may not mean alien at all. It may mean something far closer to us, and at the same time, something further away than anything we've discussed tonight. He presents himself as a microbiologist, someone who, according to his own account, became embedded with highly classified programs connected to what is often referred to as Majestic 12, though even that name begins to feel almost too small once the full scope of Dan Burrish's testimony is laid out. What emerges instead is something layered and difficult to stabilize, involving advanced biological research, covert institutional structures, and a sustained interaction with entities that challenge one of the most basic assumptions within ufology, that these beings come from somewhere else entirely. If you didn't know already, within Burrish's account, they do not. They come from here, or at least from a version of here that exists further along a branching path of time, one that has already unfolded under different conditions, shaped by decisions and events that from our current vantage point have not yet fully occurred. I know. Stay with me. This is where his narrative begins to shift from unusual to deeply disorienting, because the idea of non-human intelligence is replaced with something far more intimate. The beings often described as extraterrestrial are in his telling future humans, descendants of our own species, altered by environmental collapse, genetic decline, and the long-term consequences of a trajectory that diverged somewhere along the way. This phenomenon is no longer something external arriving at Earth, but something recursive, a loop in which humanity encounters itself, displaced across time, temporal refugees, carrying with them the consequences of a future that has already been realized elsewhere. And within that future, something has gone wrong. Burrish describes multiple future human lineages, often grouped under what are commonly referred to as J-rods, though even that term begins to stretch as the distinctions between them become clearer. These are not a single people, but a series of outcomes, each shaped by where and how the timeline unfolds. The earlier forms described as existing tens of thousands of years ahead appear closer to what we recognize as the classic grey morphology, smaller, more fragile, already showing signs of biological compromise. And within Dan's account, one such group is associated with the Roswell incident, not as visitors from another world, but as travellers moving along the same continuum, arriving here from a point much further ahead. As those timelines extend, the divergence becomes more pronounced. Some of these future lineages, particularly those described as existing around 45,000 years forward, are characterized by a kind of functional detachment, operating within a logic that appears almost mechanical, and by Burrish's interpretation, actively invested in ensuring that a specific catastrophic sequence of events takes place. Their existence depends on it, and so their interaction with humanity becomes shaped by that requirement, with abductees in some cases describing encounters that feel less like communication and more like activation, or indeed utilization. Further along still, the structure begins to branch. At around 52,000 years into the future, Burrish describes a split within humanity itself, where two distinct paths emerge from the same origin. One continues along the trajectory of decline, producing beings that, while still recognizably linked to earlier forms, are now deeply affected by hereditary conditions, their physical systems increasingly unstable, their survival dependent on intervention. The other path moves outward, away from the Earth entirely. These are described as more physically intact, more closely aligned with what we would recognize as human, though altered in subtle ways, taller, more refined, carrying with them a different kind of development, shaped by environments beyond this planet. These groups are not observers in the traditional sense, but participants in a larger effort to stabilize what has become unstable, acting at times as intermediaries between competing outcomes. At the center of all of this, a single point of tension, a future event that defines everything that follows. Some of these lineages require it to happen. The P-45s, for example, were actively trying to ensure some catastrophe took place in 2012 as a means to preserve their own existence, even allegedly seeding destructive technologies, such as the Looking Glass device, to humans. And others appeared to be working to prevent it, and by all accounts, succeeded. But within that conflict, humanity exists not as an outside observer, but as the moment in which that outcome was undecided, and in many ways still is. So according to Burrish's testimony, their presence here begins out of necessity. They aren't exploring, they're not observing, they're simply attempting to correct. Humanity in this sense becomes something like a biological archive, a version of the species that still exists prior to that collapse, carrying genetic material that has not yet undergone the same level of deterioration, and so the interaction becomes focused, clinical in places, oriented towards sampling, study, and the possibility of stabilizing what has already begun to fail. But this is of course only one layer of the story. Multiple timelines, multiple outcomes, multiple groups, each with their own relationship to what happens next. And of course, if you're unfamiliar with how Dan Burrish came to know all of this, you're probably asking that exact question now. How? Well, to put it simply, that's an entire episode in itself, one that I've linked in the description. It involves what he describes as a closely monitored relationship with one of these J-Rod beings, operating from within a facility known as S4, somewhere in the Nevada desert, not far from Area 51. If you don't know that story yet, you're in for quite a ride. But as I said at the beginning, we're not sharing Burrish's story because we necessarily believe it. We're sharing it because of what it represents, an idea that seems to be gaining quiet traction over time, that what humanity is experiencing may be far more temporally complex than we're currently equipped to understand. The possibility that the intelligences interacting with us may not be separate from us at all, but instead exist somewhere along a path we ourselves are moving toward, shaped by outcomes that, from our perspective, have not yet fully arrived. And within that possibility, there is another layer that begins to emerge. That these interactions may not be motivated solely by survival, but by awareness, an awareness of what lies ahead, of the kind of suffering or upheaval or transformation that may be waiting further along the timeline. Something that, from a sufficiently advanced perspective, even if that perspective is our own, might carry a weight that extends beyond a single moment, rippling across time in ways we don't yet fully grasp. You might call it a kind of intervention, or perhaps something closer to mitigation. The idea that if a civilization reaches a point where it understands the fragility of its own trajectory, it might attempt, in whatever limited way it can, to influence the conditions that led it there in the first place. The great filter, perhaps, though viewed not as a barrier ahead, but as something already passed through, painfully, and now somehow being revisited. Or perhaps Burrish is right in the way he frames it, that Earth, our Earth, exists as a kind of convergence point, a place where different versions of the future meet, overlap, and in some way compete. A temporal battleground. And if that's the case, then our interaction with non-human intelligence begins to take on a new tone. It becomes less about what they can do for us, and more about what humanity can do for them. I've been told that Burrish actually has some new information to share today, so I'm delighted to welcome him to the Dreamland Motel. Wait, don't tell me. He's back in Egypt, isn't he? Another J-Rod to send home. Of course. Well, not what I would call a success for our first attempt at a UFO conference. I can only apologize. I suppose in future I should just leave it to the professionals. But before we start issuing refunds en masse, I'd like to offer a few thoughts of my own. Quarantine, Reptilian Overseers, guiding hands, manipulating hybrids, and time-travelling degenerates. It's clear to me that not all of these truths can be truth. Even in a universe populated by multiple intelligences, all competing for our attention, the likelihood that each of these conclusions represents a valid corner of reality feels vanishingly small. So, who should we believe? Who do you believe? What do I believe? Well, none of them. If there's one quote I've repeated far too many times here at the Dreamland Motel, it's this. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Each of our 5 scheduled speakers tonight speaks with a kind of certainty that feels immovable. Their beliefs aren't framed as beliefs, but as something more fixed, as though someone or something handed them an answer, fully formed and without ambiguity. And that, in my opinion, is a dangerous place to operate. Because certainty leaves very little room for doubt, and where doubt disappears, dogma has a habit of taking its place. Even for myself, as someone who believes in UFOs, in the existence of non-human intelligence, and in the possibility of interaction with humanity, I have to acknowledge something uncomfortable. That one piece of evidence I would choose to show the world, the thing that would settle it beyond question, simply doesn't exist. What I have instead is something far less satisfying, a foundation built from experience, from years of reading, listening, observing, and quietly contemplating the nature of all of this. And if you were to ask me directly what I believe the phenomenon actually is, any confident answer I gave would probably reveal more about my own hubris than it would about the truth itself. So perhaps the most honest position we can take is a simple one. It's okay to say, I don't know. In fact, it might be one of the most useful things we can say, because it keeps the conversation and the questions open. It allows us to explore ideas without becoming trapped by them. It gives us permission to consider the possibilities, the arguments, and even the absurd. And most importantly, it allows us to listen. And if I could offer any kind of perspective on what we might be experiencing, I'd return to something I'm not sure I've said before. I may have. I can't remember. It's late, I'm tired, and sometimes things are worth repeating anyway. Consider the relationship between flowers and humans. Flowers are alive. Whatever form of experience they may have, if they have one at all, it is so fundamentally different from our own that we have no way of even recognizing it. And yet, we share somewhere between 40 and 60% of our own genetics with them. We have a common ancestor. In a very real sense, we are related. And still, for all practical purposes, we are entirely alien to one another. We as humans understand what plants are. We understand, we think, their limitations. We study them, cultivate them, modify them, move them from place to place, decide when they grow and when they don't. We water them, we neglect them, we harvest them, we consume them. But plants have no understanding of us. They don't know why we do what we do. They don't understand our needs, our intentions, or our decisions. Sometimes we appear and give them exactly what they need to thrive. Sometimes we disappear entirely. And sometimes something else arrives. A bee. I mean, what the hell is that? From their perspective, whatever is happening in that moment must be completely incomprehensible. And I think that's the point. From the perspective of the flower, our behavior makes no sense at all. And if that analogy doesn't land for you, I'm not sure I can help. But what I mean to say is this. Perhaps it's time we let go of the idea that we are anywhere close to understanding what's happening here. To move away from the need to assert conclusions, and instead remain where the question still lives. Curious, open, a little uncertain. Because when we start declaring truth, especially in something like this, we may just be listening to the echo of our own ego. Thanks for joining us here at the Dreamland Motel. Here's hoping the next conference goes just a little smoother. Still, if you enjoyed the content, please consider liking, subscribing, and letting me know your thoughts below. I do read every single comment. Until next time, stay uncertain. Peace.